Hello, I'm Kathryn Beaumont, the voice of Alice. Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland is one of the greatest achievements in children's literature, and so it's no mystery why Walt Disney was so keen on making a movie based on the book. It wasn't easy. It took Walt 13 years and 5 attempts before he finally got Alice on the screen. But I think it was worth it. The presentation of Alice in Wonderland that you are about to see is accompanied by interviews with Lewis Carroll experts and Disney historians who weave together the story of Lewis Carroll himself and Walt Disney's passion for making a movie based on Carroll's masterpiece. It's about two brilliant men who lived almost a century apart, but who collaborated across time to create one of the most popular films in the Disney canon. Enjoy.
I'm Brian Sibley, and I've written about Walt Disney, and I've also written about Lewis Carroll, and for some while was secretary of the Lewis Carroll Society. So I have an interesting position of being able to observe both the dream child of Lewis Carroll and that dream child as realized by Walt Disney. Oh, and before I forget, you know the title card, which has Lewis Carroll's name spelt wrong. It would be great if somebody could put that right.
I'm animation critic and historian Charles Solomon, and I'm happy to be a part of this presentation of Walt Disney's Alice in Wonderland and how he adapted the novel of the genius Lewis Carroll to the medium of animation.
I think it's interesting that Walt Disney himself wanted very much to stick closely to Lewis Carroll's book.
Stories that were the basis of many of the classic Disney films like Snow White, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty are fairy tales that exist in multiple versions. And as long as, say, Cinderella tries on the glass slipper and has to work for her mean stepmother, people will accept that as Cinderella, and you can embroider, you can add the side characters and add actions.
With Alice in Wonderland, you have a completely different case. You have a story that was already absolutely well known and absolutely rooted in relationship to the author who wrote it, Lewis Carroll. And I think to understand the film and to understand the story it's based on, you have to also understand the man who wrote it.
I'm Morton Cohen, and I have specialized in teaching and writing about Victorian literature. Lewis Carroll is one of the authors I've spent a lot of time with. His real name was Charles Lutwidge Dodson.
Charles Lutwidge Dodson was the tutor of mathematics at Christ Church, Oxford, the oldest and most illustrious of the Oxford colleges. But he had another side to his life, a side that was full of creativity and wit and amusement. And that was the world embodied by this non-existent character, Lewis Carroll.
And even Steigen. Alice.
How do we marry up this establishment figure of this clergyman who teaches mathematics and the person who writes one of the world's most famous fantasy stories? How can these two possibly coexist in the same person? To understand that, you have to go back to his childhood.
But how can one possibly pay attention to a book with no pictures in it?
He was born in January 1832. He was the son of a clergyman.
His father was an archdeacon in the Church of England. He was the third child of a family of 11 children.
Nonsense.
He loved his siblings, and because it was such a large family, he became really an instructor, a protector, a defender, and an entertainer.
And contrariwise,
Lewis Carroll was a child with a ceaselessly inquiring and imaginative mind, and he used that in entertaining his brothers and sisters.
He loved to play with them and to create jokes and riddles and games. He put on a brown wig and a white sheet and performed as a magician with all sorts of tricks.
He created and built his own puppet theatre, wrote his own puppet plays. He drew very witty little cartoons, as they might have been thought of at the time. He was quite a good comic artist.
of my own.
He created magazines for the family, sort of homemade magazines. They were called Useful and Instructive Poetry, the Rectory Umbrella, Mishmash. The family all contributed, but by far and away the best bits were always by Charles. And these little magazines became, in some cases, the origin of some of the ideas that later found their way into the Alice books and his other writings.
Charles Dodson actually had a pleasant childhood, but it wasn't without struggle.
He had two impediments, a deaf right ear that occurred after he had a bout of mumps in school. The other impediment was a stammer.
He later shared stories of being picked on at boarding school when he was away from his beloved family.
He himself got very good education, went to Richmond School first and then to Rugby, and then ultimately to Christ Church's Fathers College at Oxford.
Hi, I'm Daniel Singer. I'm a former Disney Imagineer and a great lover of Alice in Wonderland. Charles Dodson, when he graduated, he was immediately offered the position of mathematical lecturer and room and board for the rest of his life. So he became just sort of part of Christ Church.
When he went to Oxford, it was only natural that he would become acquainted with the children of his associates there, and he would behave to them in the same way as he behaved to his own siblings.
In his late 20s, he met the children of the dean of the college.
No, I'm overdue. I'm really in a stew. No time to say goodbye. Hello, I'm late.
They're all living in very close proximity to one another. Lewis Carroll has rooms in Tom Quad, the central quadrangle at Christ Church. And just a little way away, there's the Little family living in the deanery. He got on very well with the whole family. Dean Little and his wife and their 4 children. Harry, Lorena, Edith, and Alice. The Alice Little who would inspire the great British classic, Alice in Wonderland.
Goodbye, Dinah. Goodbye.
The Victorian era was an exciting time in the development of science, and Dodson was a well-educated man with an enormous curiosity. There was a lot of speculation at the time about how the world worked, how it had been created, where it came from.
The scientific speculation of the day when Lewis Carroll wrote the book definitely found its way into the book. And when Alice is falling down the rabbit hole, she muses to herself what's going on. And she says to herself, I wonder if I'm going to fall right through the center of the earth and come out the other side where people walk with their heads downwards. There was actual sort of scientific debate about things like that.
Whoa! Goodness. What if I should fall right through the center of... Ah!
One of the triumphs of Carroll's Alice books are their timelessness. More than 100 years after they were published, they still enchant us, even though some of the references, which were very much a reflection of their era, have been forgotten.
Lewis Carroll's life, as historical lives go, is extremely well documented. He kept diaries all his mature life, and he also kept a letter register for the last 35 years of his life, annotating letters in, letters out, that sort of thing. And that letter register ends with the number 98,721. And you can imagine how many letters he wrote in his life.
It's quite all right.
In a diary entry from 1863, Lewis Carroll wrote, "There is no variety in my life to record just now, except meetings with the Littles, the record of which has become almost continuous. I walked with them in the meadow this morning."
Well, I'm looking for a white rabbit. So...
The amount of time that Lewis Carroll spent with the little children is remarkable for all kinds of reasons, because although he was a tutor at Christ Church, he wasn't in quite the same class as the dean and his family.
Possible.
Dean Little, the father, was a nephew of a baronet, and Mrs. Little made a great deal of that.
Hello, I'm Paula Sigmund, and I'm a Disney historian. Alice Liddell's mother was a beautiful woman, very connected in higher social circles, and she loved the idea of Charles Dodson, who was an amateur photographer, immortalizing her family.
In point of fact, had he not written Alice in Wonderland, he would still have had a place within the history of photography as being one of the seminal influences of the way in which photography developed.
Goodness! What did I do?
He worked very hard at it and learned all the intricate, subtle ways of taking pictures.
His portraiture is immaculate. He captures the essence of characters who are posing for him.
He spent a lot of time taking pictures, and this gave him an opportunity to hang out with these really cool children that he was very fond of. They started having picnics.
What they called river picnics, going out on the river in a boat and stopping upstream at Godstow and having a tea on the shore.
Whatever will I do?
And on one of these trips, on July 4th, 1862,
Dodgson and a buddy of his named Duckworth rented a rowboat and went for a picnic with 3 of the dean's kids, including Alice, the one that he was particularly fond of. They set up on a bank of the river.
the girls asked Mr. Dodgson, as they called him, oh, well, let's have a story, that sort of thing.
So on this famous day in 1862, when the kids asked him to tell a story, it just flowed out of him.
We know from the accounts of all of the people who were involved in this relationship that there were many stories told on many days, but on that day a story was told that was the beginning of a long-running series of stories that were based around Alice.
Lewis Carroll was able to just improvise these tales.
There's a very touching account by Robinson Duckworth, who was rowing the boat with the children along with Lewis Carroll. As Carroll is telling the story, Duckworth turns and says to Lewis Carroll, are you extemporizing this story? Are you sort of making it up? And Lewis Carroll says, yes, I'm just making it up as we go along.
It's Alice who dominates, and it's about Alice, really. But they all had roles to play in the Alice story.
But I never do a thing about the weather, for the weather never does a thing for me.
In the chapter in Alice in Wonderland, The Pool of Tears, there's reference to a dodo. And Lewis Carroll, who had a slight speech impediment, a stutter or a hesitation, was himself the dodo.
Dodo?
And Duckworth, the other Dawn, is the duck. His name is Robinson Duckworth, so he's obviously the duck.
Mr. Dodo?
And then there's an eaglet, who was the sister Edith Little. And there was a lorry, who was Larina. So they're all there.
Pardon me, but would you mind helping me? Please?
Carroll not only introduced people who were present as he improvised the story of Alice, he also introduced all sorts of real-life events and people. The caucus race is a great example of this.
Forward, backward, inward, outward, come and join the chase. Nothing could be drier than a jolly caucus race.
A caucus race, where a bunch of animals run around in circles, is actually a reference to a political situation where a bunch of politicians get together and yell, and nobody's making any sense, and everybody runs around. It doesn't really get anywhere.
I'm Will Finn, and I'm an animator and story artist. The book is a little bit of an enigma. You can read things into it. Carroll was never terribly forthcoming any more than telling us that it was nonsense conceived for a real little girl called Alice. And maybe that's all it was. A lot of people see political things in it. Some people believe that Alice is really Queen Victoria, and it's her journey through the hierarchy of English politics.
There's been many ways of looking at these stories, and certainly one would suppose that in a sense Dodgson was having a laugh at the expense of people who had pompous ways of talking and looking at the world.
Oh, my goodness, I'm late.
Oh,
I'm
don't go
late.
away!
Dodgson told various versions of the story. He had such a ready wit. He could make these little girls laugh by taking one of them, sending her down a rabbit hole, and then just making all these bizarre situations.
Oh, Mr. Rabbit!
Finally, Alice begged him to write down the stories in a written form so that they could have a sort of a memento.
Alice Little wrote, I started to pester him to write down the story for me, which I had never done before. It was due to my going on and going on that he eventually gave the promise which started him writing it down at all. And Lewis Carroll's memory of that.
No.
And so to please a child I loved, I printed in manuscript and illustrated with my own crude designs the book. In writing it out, I added many fresh ideas which seemed to grow of themselves upon the original stock.
And so he wrote out a very elaborate manuscript, drew his own little drawings in the margins, and created a book that was so admired by the dean's family and by everyone who visited that they suggested to Dodgson that he publish it.
he sent it off to very dear friends, the McDonald family, who had a gaggle of children, and said, would you please read this to your children and tell me what they think of it and whether you think I should publish it. And they were all in favor of it.
Well, my name is Alice, and I'm following a white rabbit, so...
The first version of Alice's Adventures Underground has his own illustrations. He was wise enough to realize that they weren't good enough for publication and got John Tenniel, one of the great British political cartoonists, the man who was, in fact, regarded as the finest artist working in the magazine Punch and other publications of its kind in Britain.
John Tenniel was a very busy man and very famous, and it took a long time to publish, but it did finally appear.
The oysters were curious, too.
When the book first came out in the 1860s, it struck people as something very, very fresh and fun.
This book and its sequel, Through the Looking Glass, become a blast of fresh air that blows straight through children's literature, and after which it is never, ever the same again.
Well, perhaps I could spare a little time.
You could?
One thing he absolutely insisted upon was that there would never be a moral in his books, which goes exactly against what the usual tenor of children's books were in those days.
Until Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, children's literature had one single goal in mind. It was to improve the mind of the child, to make the child better behaved, to make them be quiet and observant and tidy and neat, and to do their work. It was a suppressive literature. Without Lewis Carroll, children's literature would not be what it is today. We would still be bogged down in this world of pious, moralizing literature. But Lewis Carroll just changes it in a stroke.
My brain begins to perk.
Walt Disney was probably about 9 years old when his family moved from the family farm to Kansas City. And Walt said at some point that he had read Lewis Carroll's books as a schoolboy.
It's impossible to imagine that any young man of that era would not have read that book. I suspect Walt read it a number of times, and it was something that he kept coming back to.
And in 1910, there was a silent film of Alice in Wonderland that was about an hour long. It's, by today's standards, a very crude and amateurish looking film. But I'm sure in 1910, it seemed remarkable and full of a lot of the charm that the book possesses. And it's very likely that Walt saw that. And so Walt was very aware as a teenager, as he was starting to become a commercial artist and starting his own little animation company, of the value of Alice in Wonderland as being an ideal subject for the medium of animation.
Come and walk with us.
So this was something that had, I think, obsessed Walt very, very early on.
A pleasant talk would be a sheer delight.
Yes, and should we get hungry on the way, we'll stop and have a bite.
As early as the 1920s, Walt was already thinking this story would make a great film. One of the first extensive and successful projects he had was a series called Alice in Cartoonland.
Alice in Cartoonland, it's really his first commercial success. And it was a 1920s Americanized, cartoonized Alice, about a little girl who had fantastic adventures in a cartoon universe.
The first one, Alice's Wonderland, the little girl has a dream, like Alice, of visiting this enchanted land where various things happen to her. There's a falling sequence like the one in the book when she falls down the rabbit hole. But there really isn't too much of a connection between Lewis Carroll and Disney's Alice comedies. I think it was more an inspiration and an idea and a catchy name that Walt thought of, much more than any real solid ties between what he was doing and what Lewis Carroll had done.
So after Walt basically went bankrupt in Kansas City and decided to move out to Los Angeles and try to restart his career in Hollywood, he was able to do about 56 Alice comedies, or Alice in Cartoonland, little shorts, before the distributor wasn't interested in it anymore. And Walt moved on to other things, including and leading up to the invention of Mickey Mouse.
And I think because the Alice comedies were one of the early cornerstones of his career, he somehow felt that he'd have to sooner or later drop the other shoe and deliver the real Alice as conceived by Lewis Carroll.
It's an amazing fact that Alice in Wonderland could have been Walt Disney's first animated feature-length film. Not Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. No, it could have been Alice in Wonderland. In 1931, when he was already thinking about the idea of making a full-length animated film, he bought the rights to John Tenniel's illustrations to the book, which were at that point still in copyright. So he was exploring how he might put this story on film.
He'd always wanted to do Alice in Wonderland. It was just a favorite of his. And he knew that it was such a part of common culture, that the story was so popular, that it was just a natural that people would expect Walt Disney to make a feature of Alice in Wonderland.
But then, 1933, it was announced that Paramount Pictures were about to make a star-studded version of Alice in Wonderland, and for Walt, this was temporarily the end of the road. He realized that this meant he would have to put this project aside. But Walt didn't give up that easily, because in 1936, he produced a little film called Through the Mirror, in which Mickey Mouse falls asleep reading through the looking glass and has his own dream of going through the mirror to a world beyond, with very funny gags, including lots of stuff with playing cards, which of course are part of the iconography of Alice in Wonderland.
He toyed with it over the years in terms of, should it be live action? Should it be a combination of live action and animation? And at one point, when he had a star named Luana Patton attached to the studio, she seemed like the perfect Alice. But the more they tested the material, they realized that it was going to have to be an all-animated feature.
It was around 1938, he registered the title, and he set two people to work on it. One was Al Perkins, who was a story man, and Al Perkins set about trying to find a way to take what is a very episodic story and turn it into something which had its own internal logic and continuity. The other part of this partnership, working with Al Perkins, was a man called David Hall. David Hall created hundreds and hundreds of pictures, capturing every aspect of the story. Characters that aren't in the finished film, the Duchess, the baby, the cook, the Griffin and the Mock Turtle, for example, all characters which were played with but which never finally made the movie. These pictures were then filmed one after the other, and a soundtrack was recorded with lots of actors, including Cliff Edwards, who played the voice of Jiminy Cricket. And they then watched what was called a Leica reel, a series of static pictures that you would see for a few seconds, and then another picture, and then another picture. And the reason for doing this was that what Disney wanted to do was to see how this story would play out on film. And at the end of it, Disney was not happy.
While David Hall used Tenniel's original illustrations as a jumping-off point, his artwork was too intricate to work well in animation. Also, a bit darker than I think Walt wanted the finished film to be.
Once again, the project went into abeyance.
Alice would go back on the shelf, and something that looked feasible in terms of what the artists could do, what the budget would be, would get moved forward. They would shelve it and then come back to it a few years later, which was not unusual for Disney.
If you look at the opening shot of Pinocchio, made in 1940, there's the volume of Pinocchio, and beside it are two other books. One of them is Alice in Wonderland, and the other is Peter Pan. It's just in the background to the shot, but there they are, the two projects that even then Walt Disney was thinking were going to be very, very soon made into animated films.
The 40s were a really tumultuous time at the Disney studio. World War II and a devastating labor strike and another period of near bankruptcy because Fantasia and Pinocchio didn't do as well as the studio had hoped. Walt put Alice on the back burner for a long time.
This story somehow seems to have just hung on and hung on to his imagination. He kept revisiting it, he kept coming back to the idea, but there were lots and lots of problems in facing this book and trying to interpret it to the screen.
All filmmakers realize once they start developing the story into a film that it is a very, very challenging story to make into a film that their audience is going to find satisfying. One of the ironies of Alice in Wonderland is you'd think it would be such a natural to adapt into the film medium.
It's very easy to create the characters of the Alice books in film. You just dress them up the way they're illustrated in Tenniel. That's very easy to do. And the story is easy to tell as well.
Oh, yeah?
But the one thing that is so very difficult to transfer into a film is the words, and especially the humor. the funny bits.
Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, it's incredibly amusing the way he wrote it. He had such a witty sense of humor.
Lewis Carroll had a wonderful sense of the absurd in the way that he worked puns.
One of the finest moments in the Alice books is the story that the Mock Turtle tells about lessons.
Well, there was mystery, the Mock Turtle replied, counting off the subjects on his flippers. Mystery, ancient and modern, with seaography, then drawling. The drawling master was an old conger eel. He taught us drawling, stretching, and fainting in coils. So here you see Lewis Carroll's playing with mystery for history, seaography for geography. The drawling master, not the drawing master, drawling, stretching, and fainting in coils instead of drawing, sketching, and painting in oils. The book is full of punning, playful references.
It's gifted, and it's creative, and it's very funny. And there's lots of that in the Alice books.
Even the pseudonym Lewis Carroll is a kind of a pun.
He got to Lewis Carroll by working on his own real name. He took the middle name, Lutwidge, and he turned it into Latin, Ludovicus, and then turned it back into English as Lewis. And he took his first name, Charles, turned it into Latin, Carolus, and then turned it back into Carroll. So you get Lewis Carroll that way.
Lewis Carroll's book is also full of numbers. He was a mathematician, so he understood numbers. And of course, repeatedly throughout his work, the number 42 figures very highly. The king tells Alice that it's rule 42 that nobody more than a mile high can appear in the court.
And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of explanations of why 42 was his favorite number.
The exact reason why Lewis Carroll took that number, I don't think we'll ever know, and I'm rather glad we don't know, because in a way, that makes it all the more fun. His fascination with words and puns, the way in which he plays with numbers, is just part of the whole playfulness of this man.
The challenge for Disney and his artists was to capture the playfulness of Lewis Carroll and convert his verbal nonsense into the visual medium of animation.
Disney's Alice has so many moments that are an example of the art of animation at its best. I think that the Garden of Live Flowers is a remarkable scene, especially if you compare it to Lewis Carroll's description of this moment in the book. Alice is her regular size, the flowers are small, and it's charming to hear the flowers talk. But the Disney artists decided to make Alice only 3 inches high and being dominated in a scene where the flowers are towering over her.
But of course we can talk, my dear. If there's anyone worth talking to.
The Garden of Flowers and Alice is great. Again, you have another sort of haughty adult character, not listening to her, not paying any attention, doing all the talking, and just great visual exploration of all these things like daffodils and bread and butterflies and rocking horseflies and things like that. The movie is filled with details that are extraneous by design, so a lot of the stuff that must have flashed by in the screen in the 1950s, you now have the advantage of being able to see in freeze frame and really pay attention to what they were doing. Because they took their time and really tried to explore this. They give you the world as Carroll describes it, but also adding onto it with ideas of their own.
I'm Ron Barbagallo. I'm an animation art historian and an animation art conservator. You know, in a lot of ways, the music in Alice in Wonderland is maybe its most Disney element, you know, because it does fit in very well with the type of music that was done 10 years earlier and the type of music that would still be done 10, 20 years later. And I think given how much he was going to adhere to the book, and the music was really going to let Walt have a place where he could experiment.
The staff at the Disney studio had seen Paramount's live-action film in 1933, and they didn't think very highly of it. They thought it came out very dark and grotesque and made Alice's adventures in Wonderland seem kind of unpleasant. So they decided to take an approach in the screenplay that would emphasize music. They gave every sequence a very strong motif. So every sequence, every character had a song, much more in the tradition of a Broadway musical. There's 14 songs in Disney's Alice. There's hasn't been a Disney film before or since that had as many songs in it.
And I think that's actually one of the biggest decisions Walt made, was to use music as a connective device. Because a lot of these sequences, I think, would have been visually stark and scary to people, because they are so different, and you have so much thrown at you visually, that the music kind of calms you enough that you get to have this weird floral display thrown at you in such a sort of like ordinary way. And you accept it. I mean, isn't that the genius of Alice in Wonderland, is you really do start to accept all of this.
Kathryn Beaumont really embodies Alice. I think it was a stroke of genius to let her sing the songs when she sings, because she didn't have a polished singing voice. And in fact, her voice cracks when she's singing with the flowers all in the golden afternoon, enabling the flowers to take over, and for her to have a moment where she looks embarrassed and the flowers look indulgently to her is brilliant. It's a stroke of genius.
The music in Disney's Alice is very important. In fact, the movie got an Oscar nomination, an Academy Award nomination for its score. And it didn't win that year. It went up against An American in Paris, which won. But the whole show comes off very much like a Broadway musical.
Species, or shall we say genus, are you, my dear?
Milt Kahl animated a lot of Alice. So did Les Clark. So did Mark Davis. They were all very, very skilled at capturing real and sincere feeling human character.
And did you notice her petals?
Alice has to be real, and you have to care about what she's doing and where she's going and what she's thinking. And she's a particularly good design of a real little girl, probably inspired by the illustrations in the book, obviously also by Kathryn Beaumont, who did the voice.
What Kathryn Beaumont brings to the character and enables all these other characters to work around her is an innocence and a naivety and a sweetness which really works, because one of the problems with Alice in Wonderland as a story is that Alice is constantly being confronted by characters who say seemingly nonsensical things or are cross and grouchy and grumpy. There was a particular alchemy that worked between Walt Disney and Kathryn Beaumont. There is very much this paternalistic father-daughter feel to their relationship, and I think he clearly brought out the best in her.
If you're interested in looking to see the different hands that drew Alice, the moment that is the most obvious is when she goes from the Garden of Live Flowers into the area where she's about to meet the caterpillar on his mushroom. She sort of looks up and sees a bunch of weird smoke rings floating in the air, and that's where the transition happens. A moment later, Alice, with her hand, sort of pulls apart some tall blades of grass and peeks in, and her face is a little shorter and a little more realistic looking, and you can immediately tell that a different senior animator has stepped in.
One of the things I love about the Disney film is the sequence with the caterpillar, partly because it's almost purely straight off the page of Lewis Carroll as written. What the Disney animators added to it was this wonderful dimension of the smoke from the caterpillar's hookah becoming animated.
Who are you?
The smoke around the caterpillar is a character unto itself. It really does have its own personality. It's funny, too, because it's a tug-of-war visually to see who are you supposed to pay attention to. Do you pay attention to the caterpillar, or do you pay attention to his smoke?
The vocal casting is great. Richard Haydn.
I do not know.
Who was the character who talked like this, and he had that very clipped way of talking. Who are you?
Who are you?
Why was there a hookah-smoking caterpillar in Alice in Wonderland? Was Lewis Carroll someone who experimented with hookah smoke? Well, no, he was a fairly straight-laced gentleman, but he included a lot of satire in his characters.
Everything is so confusing.
It is not.
And he was rather fascinated by an art movement at the time called the Pre-Raphaelites. He had some of them sit for him as photographic subjects, and he discovered that a lot of these avant-garde artists of his day were experimenting with hookah smoking. So Carroll, in his book, was parodying the artistic movements of the Victorian era.
The Disney artists couldn't expect audiences to catch some of Lewis Carroll's contemporary references, so they relied on what they knew best, which was personality animation, using the techniques they'd developed over the years to give a vibrancy and appeal to various classic characters.
And pour the waters of the Nile on every golden scale.
One of the masters of character animation was Erik Larson, a member of the group of elite animators Walt referred to as the 9 Old Men.
I love the caterpillar of this movie because he was largely animated by Erik Larson. Erik Larson was one of Disney's great leading animators on Figaro and Bambi's Owl, and a lot of great Disney characters. And in the 1970s and early 80s, he trained a lot of my generation of animators.
I have improved it.
The caterpillar is almost a self-caricature of Erik in a way, because Erik would think and stop and hold his lip like that. I remember one day we were looking at a picture of the character, and I said, you know, he looks like Erik Larson. And everybody laughed, and I turned around and he was standing in the doorway. And he actually said, I think he looks like Will Finn. And he slammed the door.
It might be kind of fun to think about comparing the personalities of Walt Disney and Lewis Carroll.
Lewis Carroll liked people, he loved the arts, he loved the theater, he was very fond of music. He was a well-rounded human being. He had a temper, and he did now and then explode, as it were.
Keep your temper.
But only when his own high principles were offended. He would walk out of the theater, for instance, if there was anything sacrilegious on the stage. Apart from that, as a human being, he was absolutely a respectable, decent, loving, and generous man.
3 inches is such a wretched height, and
I am exactly 3 inches high.
Both Lewis Carroll and Walt Disney loved to tell stories, and they loved to entertain children, but their approaches were very different.
Lewis Carroll, very intellectual, very cool, loved puzzles and wordplay.
By the way, I have a few more helpful hints.
Carroll was a logician, a mathematician, a very erudite man who liked to introduce parodies and mathematical games into his work. Walt Disney had a warmer, more direct approach to storytelling.
Most people are attracted to the emotional qualities of Walt's stories. His ability to turn Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs from a grim fairy tale into the beautiful feature-length film that it made you laugh and cry and feel like you really knew these characters.
One of Walt's greatest talents was as a story editor, and he had a very strong sense of story structure, how each point had to lead to another logically and emotionally. Carroll, on the other hand, doesn't seem to have been bothered by structure. The Alice books are very episodic, and it's possible to imagine reordering the chapters without it really affecting the way the narrative reads.
Where Lewis Carroll and Walt Disney really found common ground was to be able to come up with amazing and fantastic characters. With Lewis Carroll, he was able to create characters out of just ordinary figures, a caterpillar, a hare which becomes a March hare, and a Mad Hatter and the White Rabbit. And then here's Walt, who can take a character just like a little mouse and turn him into a real personality, a Mickey Mouse, or Jiminy Cricket. The cricket in the original Pinocchio story is a very minor figure, and imagine giving him the kind of personality that Walt did so that this character of the cricket actually lived well beyond the Pinocchio film.
I wonder if I'll ever get the knack of it.
Walt built on the strong characters Carroll had created, layering his own sense of entertainment on top of them, transforming them in some cases, adding to them and changing them as he felt the film demanded.
Now let's see. Where was I?
There were many times in the production of this film, and this film took many years to reach the screen, when the animators did all kinds of crazy things, and Walt Disney would keep coming back to them and say, no, 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 we don't want that. They're kind of Donald Duck gags. What we want is to get back to the book, get into the characters, look at the personalities. That's where the humor is.
And the mole rats out of the rain.
They wanted to be as musical as they could and as humorous as they could, make the story as funny as they possibly could, and not necessarily stick so much to the literal qualities of the novel, but more to the spirit of the book.
Please. Ooh.
For example, there's a jolly freelance madness to the Cheshire Cat that Disney artists picked up on and could embellish the idea, say, by having the cat take his ears off like a hat.
Oh, you're a cat.
A Cheshire Cat.
The archaic phrase, to grin like a Cheshire Cat, still is something that people are not exactly sure what it meant. But in the county of Cheshire, which is where Dodgson is from, there were cheese shops that had signs that were sometimes painted in the shape of a cat.
Oh, that depends on where.
So there'd be a cat, and there maybe was like a crescent-shaped piece of cheese painted on the sign. And so gradually people began to just assume that the crescent was the cat's smile. And so to say that someone was grinning like a Cheshire Cat was referring to the sign above a cheese shop.
Oh, by the way.
It's known that the church at Croft-on-Tees, where Lewis Carroll's father was a minister, had amongst the carvings on the wall a lion or maybe a cat with what looked like a grin. And certainly for a child sitting in a pew below the carvings, which had been somewhere up on one of the pillars, it looks as though it's grinning. Now, maybe this was the origin of the Cheshire Cat, but it doesn't really matter where the origin comes from. What's really interesting is the character as it's created.
If I were looking for a white rabbit.
These Cheshire Cat sequences were directed by Ward Kimball, but I think John Lounsbury was the actual animator on a lot of them.
I don't.
Or there's the March Hare.
Kimball is often associated with the character because he praised him as the one character who is cool while everyone else is sort of mad.
But I don't want to go among mad people.
Oh, you can't help that.
Great design, beautiful looking animation, fun voice by Sterling Holloway.
You may have noticed that I'm not all there.
Disney used Sterling Holloway again and again for characters as disparate as Kaa in The Jungle Book and the stork in Dumbo.
Goodness. If the people here are like that, I must try not to upset them.
Alice in Wonderland had a whole series of directors who sort of divided it up as if the stories were divided into chapters like the book is. And each of these segments had sort of a dominant animator who was in charge of a certain character. And Ward Kimball, of all the Disney animators, who was in charge of Tweedledum and Tweedledee and The Walrus and the Carpenter and The Mad Tea Party, really sort of creates the dominant style of the animators in that film.
Ward Kimball's animation is amazing. Some of the most visually surreal stuff he ever did.
Of all the Disney animators that are referred to as the Nine Old Men, Ward Kimball, he was the one who was looked to as sort of the crazy one in the bunch, who instead of creating the characters who are remembered for their warmth or their emotional quality, he created the crazy stuff. The animation that he did in that film really stands out as bouncy and crazy and over the top.
But I thought there was plenty of room.
Lewis Carroll is such a master of nonsense that I think everyone wants to get into that text and interpret it in their own way. And I once asked Ward Kimball, what was the weirdest thing you ever worked on at Disney? And he said Alice in Wonderland. And originally he had conceived the Mad Tea Party sequence as all being done in sort of cross-hatched John Tenniel style illustrations. At one point he said that he had the Mad Hatter looking at Alice through the correct end of a telescope, but when you saw his point of view, she was too far away. She was like tiny.
Child, this is not a birthday party.
And Walt saw it and said, okay, that's too weird. Ward Kimball always seemed to be the animator you went to. If you wanted to go so far, you broke it and then would come back and then find out where the limits were.
30 days have no. Well, An unbirthday, if you have a birthday, then you... She doesn't know what an unbirthday is.
All these things that were a part of common culture were things that Lewis Carroll brought into the book. Drinking tea had become sort of a popular thing in the Victorian era. He put a twist on everything. So, for example, at the tea party, it wasn't just having tea once a day, but it was having tea all day long, every day. And the Hatter and Hare are sort of trapped in an eternal tea party.
But there are 364 unbirthdays.
So it kind of takes the idea of a formal meal or snack time and turns it into something crazy.
Small world this is.
One of the great songs, The Very Merry on Birthday. It sounds like Lewis Carroll.
To me?
To you.
A very merry unbirthday.
For me?
For you.
Making the mundane special and the special mundane. That's sort of classic Carroll, and that song really does that in a great way.
A very merry unbirthday to you.
Twinkle, twinkle, little bat.
Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Bat, as sung by the Dormouse at the tea party, is a version of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And Lewis Carroll was sending it up. He was making fun of it.
It was lovely.
And now, my dear, you were saying that you would like to see... Pardon me.
The Mad Hatter and the March Hare, those names actually come from old expressions.
See, I'm looking for a...
Hares mate in March, and so male rabbits at that time are often seen behaving erratically.
Think up, go down.
Mad as a Hatter comes from the neurological conditions that hatters used to get because they treated the felt that went into hats with mercury, and they were essentially getting heavy metal poisoning.
More than nothing.
When you are exposed to mercury, it gradually ruins your nervous system and gives you the shakes and gives you a complete mental breakdown.
That's all about it.
In the Victorian era, everyone knew that a hatter could very easily go mad as a result of his profession.
Stop.
We don't remember that anymore. We just know that there's a Mad Hatter and a March Hare, and yes, they're both mad.
Very interesting.
Phrases like to grin like a Cheshire cat,
Why, Dinah's my cat.
to be as mad as a hatter, to be as mad as a March Hare. Those phrases became very much a part of common culture, not just because of their own reference, but because of Lewis Carroll's book. These things were concepts or phrases that everybody talked about and made everybody laugh.
My goodness. Those are the things that upset me.
Almost every illustrator since John Tenniel has put a label in the Hatter's hat, and almost all of those labels have said in this style 10 and 6, because that's what John Tenniel put in the first edition of the book.
The price in the old British monetary system is 10 shillings, 6pence. But why he chose that price or to leave the tag in is anyone's guess. Probably the tag is just an example of the Hatter's half-wittedness.
Tea?
But Lewis Carroll never says that he had a label in his hat saying in this style 10 and 6. So it shows just that this creation, this story of Alice in Wonderland is not just actually even Lewis Carroll's story, it's partly John Tenniel's story. And this collaboration of these two incredible talents, one a writer who was at the beginning of his career, and the other one of the great British political cartoonists, come together and produce this joint collaboration.
Why is a raven like a writing desk?
I beg your pardon.
Why is a raven like a writing desk?
Why is the what?
Careful. She's stark, raven mad.
But it's your silly riddle.
Alice in Wonderland is particularly interesting because it's the first Disney film where the names of the vocal talents were up there on the posters. It was part of the way in which Disney sold this film to the public. It had Ed Wynn, it had Jerry Colonna, it had Richard Haydn, Verna Felton, Bill Thompson, names that were associated with comic performers of the highest caliber, names that had a resonance with people. This is a reason to see this film.
We'll have to look into this.
The use of Ed Wynn and Jerry Colonna as voices, and also they were filmed for their visual performances, is really effective.
And undoubtedly the relationship with Alice and, for example, the Hatter and the March Hare came very much from the fact that Kathryn Beaumont was filming those scenes.
Oh, thank you, Butter. Yes, that's fine.
Oh, no.
At a real tea table with teapots and teacups with Edwin and Jerry Colonna.
You bow. Tea? Tea? Oh, I never thought of tea, of course.
No.
Tea.
No, not tea.
Sugar? Sugar, 2 spoons. Just 2 spoons, thank you, yes.
Please, be careful.
Jam?
Jam, I forgot all about jam. Just shows you what a place to do.
Mustard?
Mustard, yes, but mustard? Don't let's be silly. Lemon, that's different. There. That should do it.
James MacDonald was the head of the sound department at Disney, and he really was the master at finding these incredibly cost-effective, useful solutions.
There's only one way to stop a bad one.
One of the ways they did the fire in Bambi was Jimmy MacDonald crushing strawberry baskets into a microphone, and at that distance it sounds like a mighty oak falling. And he also happened to be a terrific voice actor. He was the voices of Jacques and Gus in Cinderella, and he was the little voice of the Dormouse.
Now where did he go to?
The Mad Tea Party is one of the strongest and most memorable sequences in the movie. The animation of the characters, the voices, the comedy, everything is working for a splendidly absurd moment that still captures much of the spirit of Carroll's original. In contrast, the Tulgey Wood sequence that follows is much more loosely based, although there are some connections to his most famous poem, Jabberwocky.
'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the momraths outgrabe.
Curious.
A stanza later in the poem is what inspired the Disney artists to create the Tulgey Wood. And as in uffish thought he stood, the Jabberwock with eyes of flame came whiffling through the Tulgey Wood and burbled as it came.
No, please. No more nonsense.
The poem is called Jabberwocky, but the animal is a Jabberwock.
The Jabberwock itself does not appear in the Disney film, although the Cheshire Cat recites the first verse of the poem.
I beg your pardon.
The poem appears in Through the Looking Glass, but it was written many, many years before.
And we have a record of it in one of the family domestic magazines, and he writes it out backwards at one point in his mirror writing, you see.
Lewis Carroll once described that many of the creatures in Jabberwocky actually had physical reality for him. For him, a rat was some sort of a green pig.
Originally, when they were writing their script, they thought that Alice might encounter a real threat in the Tulgey Wood in the form of a Jabberwock beast that is somewhat threatening to her and turns out to be somewhat comical.
There was a very funny series of offbeat, very stylized 1950s kind of storyboards done in pastel of Jabberwocky. And the Jabberwock, in this case, is a sort of strange pantomime dragon. Sort of like something out of a vaudeville show with you can see little people's legs coming out from under a cloth and this big crazy mask and a big, Jabberwocky head with wild hair and goggle eyes. And would have made a very, very entertaining sequence.
I shall certainly be glad to get out of...
They had hired Stan Freberg, a very popular comic, to do the voice of the Jabberwock. But at this point, Walt decided again that they really shouldn't get too far away from the story of a little girl who goes to a fantasy world.
They probably had a toss-up as to whether they were going to do Jabberwocky and the Walrus and the Carpenter. Happily, they went with Walrus, although I would have loved to have seen Jabberwocky.
It would be so nice if something would make sense for a change.
At one point, they talked about including the White Knight from Through the Looking Glass in the film.
This bumbling character with all his paraphernalia and his horse falling off at every opportunity, telling long, rambling, strange poems, making little jests, a kind of Don Quixote type knight.
The White Knight is one of the few characters who is genuinely kind to Alice when he meets her. And he was going to be a partial caricature of Walt, which is interesting because many Carroll scholars believe the White Knight was Carroll's kind of self-caricature, that he put himself into the knight more than into any of the other characters that he created.
The description where Dodson writes about Alice leaning against the tree in the setting sun, watching the knight as he sits there singing his song and then riding off into the sunset, is quite clearly a saying goodbye. I think by that time, Lewis Carroll wasn't saying goodbye to Alice Liddell. I think he was saying goodbye to this Alice child that he and she had created.
Never get out.
Walt Disney said he'd tried to convince the animators to introduce the White Knight because it would have brought an emotional core to the picture, because Alice could have related to the White Knight and that would have given it heart and soul.
But that was one of the sequences that never made it into the film.
Walt decided that he would use the Tulgey Wood in the film to try to make Alice a more sympathetic character. So at this point, she becomes lost and frightened and riddled with this regret that she should have listened to the advice that she'd given herself earlier and to not followed the rabbit. And so she sits down on a rock and cries and sings a rather pathetic song. And it's a real low point in the film.
That explains the trouble that I'm always in.
In the book, the author used words to amuse himself. And in the Tulgey Woods, I think you see the artist find ways visually to invent in order to amuse the audience.
This isn't something that's in the book. This is something that the Disney animators created to the spirit of the book.
The Tulgey Wood sequence is one of the interesting ones because there the artists really start conceiving of animals and creatures that have no basis in nature. It's not like the white rabbit or the dodo or things that were really there. These are just complete creatures of fancy.
You have a moment almost like in Snow White where the little critters all come up as she's sitting there. But unlike Snow White, where the critters come up and touch her, and she is comforted by their presence. These critters, they cry, they feel for her, but they disappear.
Will I ever learn to do the things I should?
And the only one that comes back to her to actually help her is the Cheshire Cat.
Out grave.
Oh, Cheshire Cat, it's you.
Did you expect?
Storyman Al Perkins came up with the idea, and you see traces of it in the finished film, of having the Cheshire Cat popping up from time to time through the film as a kind of way of keeping the story anchored and giving Alice someone to relate to.
Always here, you see, are the Queen's way.
The Cheshire Cat is sort of floating and lurking up in the trees and appearing and disappearing and saying all these Zen-like obscure comments that at first just seem to confuse Alice, but then we realize that they have a sort of a nonsensical wisdom to them.
Well, some go this way, some go that way.
Well, here's a scene that shows the relationship of the Cheshire Cat as he appears in the book, which is a little bit different than the way he appears in the film. Alice is speaking. Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? Well, that depends on where you want to get to, said the cat. I don't much care where, said Alice. Then it doesn't matter which way you go, said the cat. Well, so long as I get somewhere, Alice added as an explanation. Oh, you're sure to do that, said the cat, if you only walk long enough.
Oh, painting the roses red, and many a tear we shed, because we know they'll cease to grow. In fact, they'll soon be dead. Oh, and yet we go ahead, painting the roses red.
The artists at The Disney studio created incredibly lush, beautiful backgrounds for their films, and most of them, as artistic as they were, had a certain realistic quality. In films like Snow White and Bambi, they were using a lot of lush storybook-style artwork. For Alice, they wanted a distinctly different look, and Mary Blair was a fairly avant-garde artist who was on staff at the studio creating concept art.
The sequence painting the roses red stands out as an example of adapting Mary Blair's original designs to the film. The wonderful topiary world that they create was something she had painted in her preliminary sketches, and it made a transition to the screen much closer to her original designs than many other elements of the film.
Green.
Not aquamarine.
We're painting the roses red.
I love the cards. The cards are very funny to me because their poetry and their song is funny. The choreography on this, which again they did shoot some live action for, but you have to extrapolate that into the shape of a card.
All of this choreographed, intense changes of lighting and color. There had been several surreal moments that the Disney studio did, like in the South American films, or the pink elephant sequence in Dumbo. Alice was perfect for that, and the March of the Cards is a perfect example of that kind of animation.
There's a funny story. Judge Whittaker is one of the animators who worked on the March of the Cards and all that very complex choreography, and he had gone weeks without turning anything in to the camera department to shoot. The production manager was sort of growing worried, and he says, came down and said, "Judge, you're not making any footage. You know, it's been weeks and weeks and weeks. What is going on? Are you working for somebody else? Are you sick?" And he just lifted the scene of the cards all jumping into place and then doing that big heart shape and flipped it for him. It was still rough and he was still working on it. And the production manager said, "Ah, I see, carry on."
Count off! 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, Jack!
The rabbits.
The reason that Lewis Carroll brought the Queen of Hearts into the story is because there was a popular nursery rhyme. The Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts all on a summer's day.
Her Excellency, Her Royal Majesty, the Queen of Hearts.
So who was this Queen of Hearts, and why did she make some tarts? And to give a little background to this very simple Mother Goose rhyme, Lewis Carroll created a character and, in fact, created a whole pack of cards that comes to life to sort of represent who the Queen of Hearts was.
The Queen in Disney's Alice is sort of a composite of Carroll's Queen and the Duchess, who is sort of a big burly character in the original Tenniel illustrations. And I think Disney's treatment of the Queen of Hearts visually owes a lot to Tenniel's illustrations of the Duchess character.
Oh, no, Your Majesty, please!
One of the stories some of the animators told about the Red Queen is that she was partially based in her personality on the gossip columnist Luella Parsons, who was notoriously bad-tempered and had dark hair that she wore in a similarly severe bun.
Painting the roses red, it serves them right. They planted white and roses should be red. Oh, they're going to lose their head. Silence!
Oh, please.
The movie really kicks in for me when you introduce the Queen of Hearts, because it's not really a villain-driven movie, but the Queen of Hearts is such a force of nature that she motivates the whole rest of the movie.
Why, it's a little girl.
Yes, and I was hoping...
Look up, speak nicely, and don't twiddle your finger.
The argumentative nature of some of the characters that Alice meets suggests very much that Lewis Carroll was poking fun, not just at the way in which children had been written about in literature up to then, but the way in which adults tended to treat children.
You're talking about an age when children should be seen and not heard.
You only speak when you're spoken to, and you behave, and you learn your lessons.
Your way.
This is also reflected in a lot of the action in the movie, although it's treated in a more lighthearted, contemporary way. The reason they're not really paying attention in the movie is because you can see they're all literally crazy.
But I was only going to ask...
I'll ask the questions. Do you play croquet?
In Victorian times, it was very ordinary for the local vicar or other gentleman to come to the home of parishioners or friends and play croquet with the girls and the boys sometimes.
Card, cut! Deal, card! Card!
Walt used to play croquet with his daughters Diane and Sharon in their backyard of their home, and so it's very likely that the gags that are used in this sequence perhaps come out of some ideas of Walt when he was playing croquet with his girls.
Jimmy McDonald did one of the greatest, weirdest, funniest Disney sounds. It's the sound of the laughter of the flamingos. It really brings out the characters of these flamingos. I know when we were doing Aladdin, I had to animate some scenes with a flamingo and Iago the parrot. And I kept on trying to find that track because I wanted to use it for the flamingo. And in the end, they just used my voice, which I don't think was as good.
There are stories that really are universal and everlasting. And Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass are really two of those stories.
The reason the books have lasted through the years is that they have real insight into the essence of childhood.
Lewis Carroll has not been properly appreciated as a character who actually stands at a kind of cusp in the history of literature, certainly children's literature. He's a character who began, I think, seeing things in a way differently to the way people had seen them before. He saw children differently, he saw childhood differently. And the way in which he reflected that in his writings is absolutely key to the way in which our understanding of children began to change.
Oh, well, that's the whole theme of the book, is the trouble that a child has in an adult society. And that is why children feel for Alice and can not only sympathize, but have a bond with her because they have experienced the same kind of treatment.
Do you want us both to lose our heads?
Lewis Carroll's approach to telling stories for children was recognizing children as a different kind of audience than had been heard or thought of for children's literature previously.
The books have a special charm and a special magic that I think Walt, when he was a small boy, responded to. Walt and Lewis Carroll, I think in some ways there was something in their imaginations that resonated and that made Carroll's work appeal to Walt.
I say, how are you getting on?
Alice in Wonderland, I think, more than any other piece of subject matter that Walt Disney ever was involved with, is really a lifelong project for him.
There!
Finally, to pay tribute to the notion that he had in his youth, he does it in a very grand way.
If I lose my temper, you lose your head. Understand?
The film is really appreciated as an artistic achievement, much more so than any sort of emotional or childlike level. One appreciates it for its cleverness, for its amusing qualities, for the ability of the artist to have found the humor in these odd situations and brought them to the screen in a uniquely collaborative way, where painters and animators and the vocal performances really come together to make it a film that you experience on an artistic level.
And the legacy of it is that it brought new interest in the story of Alice.
A little trial.
Very well, then.
It's quite hard to understand the relationship between Alice Little and Charles Dodgson because it's a relationship which actually is intense, probably for quite a reasonably short period of time, and yet the ramifications of it reach out on and are still with us today and are still being written about by people.
And the king.
People still wonder today, what is it that made this relationship between Lewis Carroll and Alice Little so profound? Did this relationship take on more meaning simply because the book became so famous?
Get to the part where I lose my temper.
Well, he did have a great deal of affection, and you might say love. Indeed, I think it was love for the real Alice. but it was cut off by Mrs. Little.
We will never know now the exact reason why Lewis Carroll's relationship is ruptured with the Little family. It was possibly rumored that he was becoming too attached to Lorena, Alice's elder sister.
Lewis Carroll wasn't eligible. Mrs. Little wouldn't have a mere Oxford Don for a son-in-law.
It was also rumored that he was spending time with these three girls whose governess, they supposed in Oxford scandal terms, was the real object of Charles Dodson's affections. Miss Prickett, who was the governess, who must have been a fairly fearsome woman because she's been described as being the possible origin of the Red Queen, suddenly was being linked in undergraduate gossip with the name of Charles Dodson.
Unimportant, Your Majesty.
But we really don't know what happened. We just know that there was apparently a reconciliation between Lewis Carroll and the Little family after they were apart for about 6 months.
They did become friendly again, but not by any means with the intensity that they had before.
They corresponded occasionally, and as she became an adult, I think she kept her fond memories of him from the way she wrote and talked about him subsequently.
Oh, twinkle, twinkle. What next?
Her life was tragic. There was a point when Alice was actually seeing, I think romantically, Prince Leopold, Queen Victoria's youngest son. And that would have pleased Mrs. Little very much. But Victoria lowered the axe that wouldn't have it.
Dear, today is your unbirthday, too.
Alice got married to a man called Reginald Hargreaves. She became, by all accounts, a fairly formidable woman. She was very difficult with her sons, forbidding them to get married.
She lost 2 sons in the war, and the one son who remained was something of a playboy and squandered the family fortune.
And she subsequently did sell some of her possessions, the manuscripts, the letters that Dodgson had sent her.
Yes, my dear.
They met again for tea many, many years later, but obviously they were much different people.
He records that in his diary, yes. And it was a nice, pleasant visit.
Oh, stop him! Stop him! Catch him!
Somebody help me! Catch him! The jam!
The jam by order!
Lewis Carroll remained a bachelor all his life. He continued writing, photographing, studying mathematics and logic. I don't think Carroll expected the Alice books to cause the sensation they did, to become as popular as they did. He found himself a more prominent figure than he expected to be, and I think perhaps wanted to be.
Dodson really was loved and was viewed as a very sweet, gentle soul.
He died 13 days before his 66th birthday in January 1898.
A friend wrote of his funeral. His body was laid to rest while the slow bell tolled the passing of the sweetest soul that ever looked with human eye.
Indeed. Why, you're not a queen.
Alice became the inheritor of the whole Alice Adventures in Wonderland myth.
And I think it must have been immensely perplexing for Alice Little herself, particularly as she grew older, to have people relating to her as the person who was the child in this book. In the 1930s, there was a huge increase of interest in Alice in Wonderland because in 1932, Alice Hargreaves went to New York and everybody suddenly got terribly interested in this person who'd been Lewis Carroll's muse, and the papers and magazines and news broadcasts were full of stories about the real Alice.
Then it is true that you are the original Alice in Wonderland, Mrs. Hargreaves.
Well, yes, the story was told to me. And my sisters, we were all in a boat together with Mr. Dodson, who was rowing us down the river.
For Alice Hargreaves, how bizarre. She should get pulled out of obscurity and is expected to remember intimate stories about her relationship with Charles Dodson, which frankly, she really can't recall very easily.
She was in her 80s already and didn't live much longer after she got back.
Well, I do.
Who are you?
You know, it seems Lewis Carroll was really aware of the transformative effect of this relationship. Looking back on it many years later in 1887, he described it wistfully.
Stand back from the shadowy past, Alice, the child of my dreams. Full many a year has slipped away since that golden afternoon that gave thee birth. But I can call it up almost as clearly as if it were yesterday. The three eager faces, hungry for news of fairyland, and who would not be said nay to, from whose lips, "Tell us a story, please," had all the stern immutability of fate.
Alice! 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 Will you kindly pay attention and recite your lesson?
My feeling about it is that here is this man who saw in this child, Alice Pleasance Little, a quality of something that was very precious. And he celebrated it by creating another Alice, an Alice that's a fictional character who has this extraordinary adventure, a free, unshackled adventure of imagination.
Come along, it's time for tea.
How wonderful it is, though, that the joy of that relationship between the clergyman who became known as Lewis Carroll and the Alice who became world famous as Alice of Alice in Wonderland, how wonderful that's captured for us forever.